Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into something that, well, it feels incredibly relevant right now. It's about how we all learn and think in this world, just completely full of digital tools, powerful AI. You know that feeling, infinite knowledge is just like a few taps away, always there.
Yeah, and that sense of instant access, it creates a really fascinating situation, actually. And the source we're diving into today explores that head on.
Okay.
We're looking at a chapter called The Memory Paradox, Why Our Brains Need Knowledge in an Age of AI. It's by Barbara Oakley and some colleagues, and it's been accepted for a book coming out on the future of AI.
The Memory Paradox. Okay, yeah, that title itself makes you stop and think. The core idea seems to be that even with all this information out there, our own knowledge, the stuff stored right here in our heads, is actually more crucial than ever.
That's exactly it. And our mission today is really to get under the skin of why. Why is that the case? Based on, the neuroscience. Why, when technology can seemingly do all the remembering for us, is building up our own internal knowledge so deeply important for how we think?
Right. And the source, it doesn't pull any punches, does it? It asks this huge question. Could our reliance on, our phones, the internet, all these external aids, could it actually be changing, maybe even sort of eroding our core cognitive abilities?
It's not just philosophical musing either.
Yeah.
The authors, they get like this paradox to some, pretty surprising trends we've seen over the last few decades. Things like shifts in IQ scores in developed nations.
Really?
Yeah, and changes in how we approach education. There seems to be a link there, or at least a correlation that's definitely worth digging into.
Okay, all right. Let's dive into that central idea then, the memory paradox itself. The source argues, basically, that the more we lean on external tools, offload our thinking,
right,
the less we actually exercise and develop our own fundamental brain power.
And that's the term they use, cognitive offloading. It's using anything outside your brain, your smartphone, a calculator, Google, to store info or handle tasks that, your brain could do. It just reduces the immediate mental heavy lifting.
And the common thinking, especially lately, has kind of been, why bother memorizing it? You can just look it up. Sounds efficient, doesn't it?
It does sound efficient. That's the appeal, absolutely. But the neuroscience the source lays out suggests this approach, it has some pretty significant hidden costs. The fundamental point they make is that knowledge and skills, they're not separate things.
Right.
They're deeply intertwined,
yeah,
like two sides of the same coin in your brain. If you only rely on that external device, you might never truly build that crucial internal connection between knowing a fact and knowing how to use it skillfully.
So just having the information available isn't enough. It's about what happens inside our own heads. How does the brain actually, process and store things in a way that leads to real skill?
Well, the source really emphasizes that your brain uses at least two major memory systems, and they work together.
Okay, tell us about the first one.
So first up is your declarative memory system. This is the conscious stuff, facts, concepts, things you've experienced that you can intentionally bring to mind.
Like remembering historical dates or what you had for breakfast?
Exactly. Scientific formulas, a specific conversation you had. This system relies mainly on brain structures like the hippocampus and areas in the medial temporal lobe. It's the explicit knowing that.
Got it.
And it's relatively quick to learn things this way. You hear a new fact once, maybe you remember it. It's flexible too. Lets you combine different bits of knowledge to reason or tackle new problems. The downside, I guess, is that pulling that information out can sometimes be slower, more effortful than the other system.
Okay. And traditional teaching, like lectures, that mainly hits this system.
Yeah, exactly. Lectures, textbooks, they're feeding that declarative system.
Right. And the second system?
That's your procedural memory. This is more about the gradual building up of habits, skills, automatic routines, things like riding a bike, touch typing, playing an instrument, even doing basic math in your head really fast.
The muscle memory kind of thing, but for thoughts too?
Precisely. It involves the basal ganglia and related brain areas. Now this one is much slower to build. It needs repetition, practice, experience. You can't just read about it.
But once you got it,
then it's incredibly fast, automatic, often happens without you even consciously thinking about it. And the source mentions our understanding of the basal ganglia has grown. It's not just motor habits. It seems crucial for recognizing patterns in language, in math, even those sudden aha moments of insight.
Oh, okay.
And they draw this interesting parallel to concepts in AI, like grokking, where a model, after tons of training, suddenly seems to just get the underlying pattern.
That's fascinating. So the brain's knack for automatic pattern spotting is kind of like AI grokking.
Okay.
How do these two systems, declarative and procedural, work together then to build real expertise?
Well, they have this really dynamic relationship.
Mhm.
Often, knowledge starts out declarative, you learn a fact, explicitly,
Right.
but with repeated use, with practice, applying it. That knowledge can actually transition. It becomes more automatic, more intuitive. It starts relying more heavily on the procedural system. And that shift, it's absolutely fundamental for developing real fluency and expertise in anything.
You mentioned the multiplication table example from the source.
Yeah, that's a perfect illustration. A child first learns 4 times 3 equals 12. It's a declarative fact. They might have to consciously think about it, maybe even count. But after enough practice drills, it shifts. It becomes procedural. They just know it instantly, automatic. Now contrast that with a student who always reaches for a calculator for 4 by 3.
They get the right answer.
They get the right answer, sure. But they completely bypass that whole process of building the automatic intuitive number sense in their procedural memory. And that lack of internal feel for numbers can really hold them back later when they need to do things like, say, estimate or reduce fractions easily.
Okay, I see. So constantly offloading using the calculator, it basically shortcuts that vital transition from conscious knowing to automatic skill.
Exactly that. When you rely too heavily on external aids, your brain's procedural circuits, especially the ones involved in automating knowledge, they just don't get the workout they need. You end up stuck using slower, more effortful conscious thinking.
Or just relying on the tool itself.
Right. And that eats up your valuable working memory, that mental workspace you have, leaves less capacity for tackling the higher level parts of a problem. And the source points out something really interesting. Those fast, intuitive, procedural insights. They seem to form best when they connect to knowledge that's already deeply internalized, not just stuff you know where to look up.
And they also mentioned something called long-term working memory. What's that about?
Yeah, it's a concept suggesting we have a system that lets us hold and manipulate complex ideas over longer periods, like minutes or even hours. Think about following a complex argument in a long lecture or working through a multi-step problem. It's crucial for making connections across different pieces of information over time. Offloading the basic building blocks, looking everything up constantly, it means you're not really using this cognitive workspace effectively. It hinders your ability to integrate information and build those bigger pictures in real time.
So again, just knowing where the information is stored externally isn't the same as having it readily available in your brain for these systems to work with.
Not even close. It actually interrupts the very processes needed for deep learning and for building skills.
And this connects to how the brain actually learns from mistakes, right? The source talks about prediction errors.
Yeah, this is a really fundamental mechanism. It's kind of like how reinforcement learning works in AI, actually. Your brain is constantly making predictions about what should happen next, when reality doesn't match the prediction.
Like when you make a calculation error or expect one thing and see another.
Exactly. That mismatch, that surprise, that's not right. That's a prediction error signal. And the neuroscience shows this surprise triggers neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine.
Okay.
They essentially flag the neural connections that led to the wrong prediction. Dopamine helps reinforce the correct pathways for next time, and norepinephrine sharpens your focus. It's how your brain learns from feedback, constantly refining its internal models.
But crucially, for this whole system to work, you need to have an expectation in the first place.
This is the absolute key. The effectiveness of the prediction error system hinges on having strong internal expectations. And where do those come from? They're built from internalized knowledge, from memorization, from practice. If you haven't internalized the multiplication factor...
You don't expect 4 by 3 to be 12.
Exactly. You don't have a strong internal prediction. So if a calculator spits out the wrong answer due to a typo, or if you miscalculate yourself, your brain might not flag it.
There's no wait a minute moment.
Precisely. And the source uses that really powerful example of a nursing student calculating a drug dosage. If they haven't internalized basic arithmetic, they might punch numbers into a calculator incorrectly. The dose could be dangerously wrong, but because they lack the internal knowledge to predict roughly what the answer should be, their brain doesn't generate that crucial prediction error signal. The mistake goes unnoticed.
Wow, that's Yeah, that's a really stark illustration of the potential consequences.
It really is, and it highlights why learning techniques that force you to actively retrieve and use information from your own memory, things like retrieval practice, flashcards, self-testing, are so effective. They create those essential opportunities for your brain to make predictions and learn from the errors. Offloading just bypasses all of that.
Okay, so you build this internal knowledge, you practice it, it becomes more automatic. But how does the brain organize all this stuff? The source talks about schemata.
Right, schema is the singular, schemata is the plural. Think of them as like mental frameworks or organizational structures. They're dynamic. It's like the mental map you use to navigate your city, or the script you expect to follow when you go into a restaurant.
So not just passive files of facts, but active structures.
Exactly. They organize knowledge into meaningful patterns. They have slots for variables. They can nest inside each other hierarchically. Forming these rich, elaborate schemata is really the hallmark of expertise. Think of a chess grandmaster. They don't see individual pieces. They see complex, interconnected patterns, chunks of information, because they have these sophisticated schemata.
And how do they form?
The source talks about working memory as the cauldron where schemata are forged. You have to hold different pieces of information in mind simultaneously and actively bind them together. If your working memory is overloaded with too much raw information, or if you keep offloading the pieces instead of holding them internally,
You can't build the structure.
you can't build a coherent structure. The schema falls apart.
And they also connect this idea to neural manifolds. Sounds complex.
It's basically the underlying neural reality. Think of these as organized patterns of brain activity.
Yeah.
Instead of messy, high-dimensional activity for every little thing, expertise involves creating these more efficient, lower-dimensional maps or manifolds in the brain that represent structured knowledge. Schemata likely correspond to these efficient neural manifolds. They let you process information within your area of expertise much more quickly and effectively.
Okay, so building schemata means building more efficient pathways in the brain, and offloading gets in the way of that too.
Absolutely. If you're constantly looking things up, you're not doing the active work of integrating those pieces into your existing internal framework. The source uses a great analogy. It's like trying to build a complex jigsaw puzzle. But instead of internalizing the overall picture and how pieces fit, you have to glance back at the box lid for every single piece. You never build the internal picture. Each problem feels brand new because you haven't formed the underlying schema.
And that's where the idea of biological pointers comes in.
Exactly. Research cited in the source shows that when we know information is easily available externally, like on Google, we tend to shift our memory. We remember where to find the information, the pointer, the location, maybe the gist, rather than the actual details.
The Google effect.
Right. And this creates what they call the illusion of knowledge. You feel knowledgeable because you know you can find the answer quickly, but your actual internal schema, your understanding, remains quite shallow. The source is really clear on this. A pointer to information is fundamentally different from having that information integrated into your own rich, connected knowledge structure. A schema lets you understand, predict, and apply knowledge. A pointer just tells you the info exists somewhere else.
Like knowing the library exists versus actually having read the books and connected the ideas.
Perfect analogy. The library is not much use if you don't have enough internal knowledge to even know what questions to ask or how to evaluate the information you find there.
So, you might know about a topic, but lack that deep, flexible understanding that comes from building a schema internally.
Precisely. And the neural evidence backs this up. Areas like the medial prefrontal cortex are key for integrating new information with your existing schemata. If you don't have a solid schema to connect things to, that integration process is inefficient, or it might not happen at all. Your brain stays stuck in that effortful novice mode when tackling problems in that area. They even mentioned a study with flight trainees showing how training literally reshapes brain activity, creating these more efficient neural states, building those internal cognitive maps or manifolds.
That GPS analogy really hits home. Following the directions step by step is one thing.
Yeah.
But actually navigating yourself, building your own mental map of the sea, that's a completely different level of understanding and capability. You're lost without the tool if you haven't built the internal map.
Exactly. That internal map gives you flexibility, allows for shortcuts, gives you intuition. The GPS doesn't provide that.
Okay, so let's broaden out. How does this neuroscience connect to bigger trends in, say, education and society? The source gives some historical context.
Yeah, it points to a pretty significant shift, starting around the mid to late 20th century. Education started moving away from rote memorization and drills the stuff sometimes called drill and kill.
Right.
And the emphasis shifted towards things like learning how to learn, critical thinking, problem solving. Often summed up with that phrase, you don't need to memorize it, you can always look it up.
And they bring in Daisy Christodoulou here.
They do. She's quoted calling that idea that knowledge doesn't matter anymore because of search engines the biggest contemporary myth about education. Her argument, which aligns with the source, is that you can't do critical thinking or problem solving effectively in a vacuum. You need a rich base of knowledge to think critically about.
And this educational shift happened right around the time that technology made offloading super easy: calculators, then personal computers, then the internet.
The timing is certainly striking. And, let's be honest, the source points out that deep thinking can feel effortful. Cognitive offloading is often just easier, the path of least resistance. It's appealing.
They even showed this trend using language analysis in books.
Yeah, they looked at the frequency of terms in published literature over time. They found increasing emphasis on things like conceptual understanding and critical thinking, while the sentiment towards terms like rote learning became much more negative. It tracks chronologically with the rise of readily available external information storage.
But then you have people like E.D. Hirsch Jr. warning that without that foundation of domain-specific knowledge, critical thinking falters.
Exactly. That's the core paradox they keep coming back to. By de-emphasizing the acquisition of foundational facts and knowledge, we might inadvertently be undermining the very higher-level skills we want to foster. You need background knowledge to make sense of new information, to ask good questions, to spot errors or inconsistencies.
Yeah.
They mentioned that study by Miller and Galdea where kids looked up unfamiliar words in a dictionary, but then used them incorrectly in sentences because they lacked the contextual knowledge to truly understand the definitions they found. External resources are powerful, but they amplify existing knowledge. They don't substitute for it.
Okay, which brings us to that really provocative data point about the Flynn Effect. Tell us about that.
So the Flynn Effect is this well-documented phenomenon where IQ scores were steadily rising throughout most of the 20th century in developed countries, pretty consistently, about 3 points per decade.
And that was attributed to things like better nutrition, more schooling.
Exactly. Environmental factors seem to be driving it.
Yeah.
But the source points out that this trend has stalled and actually reversed in many places.
Reversed. IQ scores are going down.
In many affluent countries, yes. Starting with cohorts born roughly after the mid-1970s, the scores plateaued and then began to decline. Data from Norway, for example, showed drops of up to 7 points per generation. Similar trends have been seen in other developed nations.
Wow. And they mentioned this is happening within families.
That's a really key point. It suggests it's not just about changes in population genetics, but something environmental affecting younger siblings compared to older ones within the same family.
And the timing, again.
The timing is, well, impossible to ignore. This reversal started becoming apparent in generations that grew up after the big educational shifts away from memorization and during the explosion of personal computing and internet dependence.
Okay, so correlation isn't causation. We always have to say that.
Absolutely. Need to be cautious there.
But it's a pretty striking chronological link. Could it be that the cognitive skills driving the original Flynn effect, maybe things like mental arithmetic, vocabulary, general knowledge, skills, perhaps exercised more by previous educational methods, are simply being exercised less now?
That's the hypothesis the source strongly suggests we should consider. And the pattern of the decline seems to fit. The drops are often most pronounced in areas like verbal reasoning, vocabulary, and general knowledge, exactly the kinds of knowledge-rich abilities that might be affected by less emphasis on acquisition and more reliance on offloading. Meanwhile, things like processing speeds seem more stable, or have even improved slightly. They also touch on potential links to less effective math teaching approaches, given the known correlation between math skills and general cognitive ability, or IQ.
It really does feel like we're looking at a potential shift in the cognitive landscape over the past few decades.
It does. And the source uses this reversal as a serious flag, suggesting we need to critically reevaluate our assumptions about knowledge in the digital age.
And now, enter generative AI, ChatGPT, and the like. This feels like cognitive offloading on steroids.
It's definitely the next major iteration, isn't it? And it poses the same core question, perhaps even more urgently. Is this incredible tool primarily enhancing our learning and thinking? Or is it mainly substituting for the cognitive work we need to do ourselves?
And the early research they cite suggests substitution is a real risk. They talk about metacognitive laziness.
Yeah, that study by Fan and colleagues is quite revealing. They had students use ChatGPT to help write essays. The resulting essays were better, objectively.
Okay.
But the students themselves showed no improvement in their actual knowledge of the essay topic compared to controls. In fact, their retention of the material was worse. They also engaged in less self-correction and reflection during the writing process. It seems they essentially let the AI do the heavy cognitive lifting involved in synthesizing information, structuring arguments, the very stuff that builds understanding.
So it seems like the impact of AI could be very different depending on your starting point, how much you already know.
That seems to be a crucial distinction emerging from the research. For learners who already have strong, well-developed internal knowledge structures, rich schemata.
To people who are already experts, or at least knowledgeable.
Right. For them, AI can be a powerful amplifier. They possess the internal framework to critically evaluate the AI's output, to spot errors, to ask better questions, and to integrate the useful bits effectively.
But if you're still trying to build those foundations...
That's where the danger lies, according to the source. Without that solid internal knowledge base, you're much less equipped to judge the AI's output. You might accept plausible-sounding nonsense because you lack the background to know better. You mistake the AI's articulate fluency for your own understanding.
And you bypass the struggle.
You bypass the essential cognitive labor things, like retrieving information from your own memory, wrestling with concepts, detecting errors, integrating new ideas into what you already know. That's the work that builds lasting memory, skills, and understanding. The source mentions several other studies pointing in this direction. Knowledge workers becoming less critical when using AI assistance, students' math performance dropping significantly on exams when the AI tool was removed, programming students showing lower self-efficacy and worse learning outcomes. The pattern suggests AI often acts as a cognitive crutch, preventing that vital declarative to procedural shift we talked about.
And there's that irony you mentioned. AI educational tools might even perpetuate the problem if they're trained on data that reflects these existing biases against knowledge acquisition.
Yeah, the source raises that concern. If AI tutors are trained on educational materials that already de-emphasize foundational knowledge, they might just replicate those same pedagogical approaches, potentially reinforcing the cycle.
Okay, so given all this, the answer isn't simply ban technology, right? That's impossible and probably undesirable.
No, not at all. And the source is clear about that. Cognitive offloading itself isn't new or inherently bad. Writing things down is offloading. Using a calendar is offloading. They even mentioned Ben Franklin's method of summarizing texts, then trying to reconstruct them from memory, using just brief notes. That's a sophisticated blend of offloading and active retrieval practice.
So the issue isn't offloading per se.
The issue is when offloading completely replaces the initial learning and consolidation phases needed to build that robust internal knowledge in the first place.
The source used that striking term, pathological altruism, for some educational reforms.
Yeah, it's a provocative term. The idea is that some reforms, while perhaps well-intentioned, like wanting to free students from boring memorization, might have inadvertently backfired if they ended up undermining the cognitive foundations necessary for the higher-level thinking they aim to promote.
So how do we strike a better balance then? The source does offer some concrete evidence-based strategies, right, for educators, for learners.
Yes, they propose several practical approaches. First, embrace desirable difficulty, but manage it carefully. Learning requires some productive struggle, like trying to retrieve an answer before you look it up. But you don't want it to be so difficult that the learner just gets frustrated and gives up. Research suggests aiming for around an 85% success rate during practice might be a good target, challenging enough to promote learning, but successful enough to keep motivation up and effectively tune those schemas.
Not too easy, not too hard. The Goldilocks zone for learning.
Kinda, yeah. Second, they strongly advocate for deliberately assigning foundational knowledge for memorization and practice. Overlearning the basics, key facts, vocabulary, formulas, procedures until they become automatic isn't just tedious work. It's essential. It frees up your limited working memory to focus on more complex aspects of a task. Tools like spaced repetition software, like Anki, can be really effective for this.
Build that internal scaffolding solid first.
Exactly. Third, incorporate procedural training without aids where feasible. Practice doing mental math instead of always reaching for the calculator. Mentally rehearse steps in a process. Recite key arguments or definitions from memory. This helps cultivate that fluency and intuition that resides in the procedural system. Think of pilots practicing manual takeoffs and landings. Even though autopilot exists, you need the underlying skill.
Keep that internal skill sharp, even if you have tools.
Right. Fourth, integrate technology strategically as a supplement, not a substitute. Think about how AI or other tools can be used for active engagement. Maybe the AI provides hints when you're stuck, rather than the full answer. Maybe you use a tool to check your work after you've attempted it yourself. The Ghana AI tutor study they mentioned is a positive example. The tech was designed to provide scaffolding in practice, ensuring the learner was still doing the core cognitive work.
So the tool assists the learning process, it doesn't replace it.
That's the goal. Fifth, actively promote the building of internal knowledge structures. Encourage learners, or yourself, to constantly make connections internally. How does this new information relate to what I already know? Don't just rely on external aids like concept mapping software, which can sometimes create an illusion of understanding without the deep mental integration. Remember, the procedural system learns best through internal processing and practice.
Encourage drawing the map inside your own head, not just looking at one.
That's a great way to put it. And finally, educate learners and ourselves about metacognition. Help people understand this crucial difference between knowing where to find information and truly knowing it, understanding it deeply. Be aware of the illusion of knowledge. Encourage reflection on learning processes and making conscious choices about what's worth committing to internal memory. Model a balanced approach. Okay, let's first see what we know from memory, then let's look up what we need.
It really forces you to think about your own habits, doesn't it? How you approach learning, how you use information day to day. It sounds like storing knowledge in your own memory isn't just old-fashioned. It's actually fundamental for effective thinking, especially now.
It really seems to be. The goal isn't rejecting technology that would be foolish. It's about integrating it wisely. And paradoxically, having a strong internal knowledge base doesn't make technology obsolete. It makes you a much better, more effective, more discerning user of that technology.
Because you have the foundation to evaluate it, to ask the right question.
Exactly, to evaluate the answers you get and actually do something meaningful with the information rather than just passively consuming it.
Ultimately, it comes back to what's happening inside our own heads, in our neurons. That's what determines our capabilities. An insight that doesn't form because we offloaded the necessary pieces. A skill that never becomes automatic through practice. A schema that never gets built because we didn't connect the dots internally. These represent lost potential for deeper thinking and creativity.
That internal cognitive work, even when it feels hard, seems to be the necessary investment for building lasting understanding and genuine capability.
And the source leaves us with one last really interesting thought to chew on. It challenges that common idea that learning has to be instantly easy or fun to grab people's attention.
Right. They point out that often genuine, lasting interest in a subject doesn't come first. It actually develops as you gain proficiency, as you get better at something, as you start to master it.
The satisfaction of competence builds interest.
Exactly. That feeling of growing competence, of your capabilities expanding, that can be the real driver of sustained interest and engagement, rather than needing everything to be effortless and entertaining from the very beginning.
So maybe that desirable difficulty we talked about, that productive struggle, isn't just necessary for learning, but might actually be key to sparking and sustaining real long-term interest. A very different way to think about motivation.
It certainly is.
So as you go about your day, facing that constant stream of information, the constant temptation of the instant answer, maybe take a moment. Think about your own habits. How are you intentionally working to build your internal knowledge bank? What are you choosing to truly internalize versus what are you letting the tools handle completely? Because, based on this deep dive, that knowledge inside your own head, that's still your most powerful asset.